Everyone, good evening. Welcome to this new lecture in our program on American literature. Today's topic is on slave narratives. Basically, this is a long, extensive tradition of excellent writings that were written by either formerly enslaved people or people who were fugitives on the run from slavery, and who succeeded in writing accounts of their experiences in slavery and their journey towards freedom. It's a very big tradition in American literature. It has had a huge impact on the development of American literature and culture, and it definitely deserves a place of honor in American literature. So let's begin. Slave narratives and their importance in American literature. First of all, what are slave narratives? Let's begin with the definition. So slave narratives are an account of the life or a major portion of the life of a fugitive or former slave. Either written, they can be written, or they can be orally related by the slave personally. Slave narratives comprise one of the most influential traditions in American literature, shaping the form and themes of some of the most celebrated and controversial writings, both in fiction and in autobiography, in the history of the United States. So this is a basic definition. It tells us what exactly they're about and what their importance and their size in the history of American literature. Let's talk about who wrote slave narratives, right? Well, the vast majority of American slave narratives were authored by African Americans. This is the large part of these slave narratives were written by African Americans. But there's also other traditions. For example, there is a tradition of slave narratives that were written by white American sailors who were taken captives by North African pirates, right? In the 19th century, North African pirates off the coast of Morocco or Algeria, they took, considerable numbers of European or American sailors captives, and these people became slaves in North Africa, in Algeria or Morocco. And many of these white American sailors actually wrote their slave narrative. We find also a tradition of slave narratives written by African-born Muslims who were taken captive and were enslaved and were taken to the Americas. And these people knew how to read and write, at least in Arabic. So they wrote their experience in slavery in Arabic, and those writings are still available today for historians, for students. Even we have an experience of the Cuban poet Juan Francisco Manzano, who also happened to be enslaved and wrote about his experience in slavery. The tradition that we are focused on in this lecture is the tradition of slave narratives written by African Americans, right? These are African people who were taken captive in Africa and taken to the Americas, and there they managed to, first of all, educate themselves into this foreign language, English, and then they managed to write their experience, or they were helped by a sympathetic person, a journalist or a lawyer or a politician, they were helped to write their experience in slavery. Let's look at the numbers a little bit. How big is this tradition of slave narratives? I mean, how many are there? 5, 10? Well, the numbers are quite big. From 1760, which is just before the declaration of the United States as a country, right? Just before the War of Independence in the United States. So from 1760 to the end of the Civil War in the United States, approximately 100 autobiographies of fugitive or former slaves appeared. So this is just within the space of 100 years, we have 100 autobiographies, almost one a year, right? These autobiographies of either fugitives, people who were enslaved and ran away, became fugitives and managed to write their story on the run, or people who were former slaves and, achieved their freedom, and then they wrote their autobiography. So we have 100 autobiography in the space from 1760 to the Civil War in the United States. After slavery was abolished in the United States in 1865, at least 50 former slaves wrote or dictated book-length accounts of their lives. So this is after 1865, when slavery was abolished. At least 50 former slaves wrote or dictated book-length accounts of their lives. During the Great Depression, that's in 1929 and the 1930s, the WPA Federal Writers Project gathered oral personal histories from 2,500 former slaves whose testimony eventually filled 40 volumes. So this is the WPA Federal Writers Project. This was a project that was started by the federal government in the 1930s. It funded writers, journalists to go around and find people who were still alive, who used to be enslaved, and interview them and try to take an account, a record of their life in slavery. Many of these interviews were done orally, so they are recorded either in audio or video formats and are available. You can find many of them on YouTube, where people who were very advanced in life, they were in their 90s, some of them in their 80s, but they still could remember a time when they were slaves, and they talk about their experience. This project was organized and funded by the Library of Congress, and it managed to compile an oral archive of people talking about their experience in slavery. Okay, slave narratives, there are 4 types of slave narratives, right? There's 4 types. The first is the autobiography. So a slave narrative can be autobiographical, which means it is written by the enslaved person himself or herself. This is autobiography. It can be a biography, right? A biographical slave narrative, which means it is written by someone other than the enslaved person, either a friend or a journalist or a lawyer, etc. So we have autobiographies written by the enslaved person themselves, and we have biographies. They are written by someone other than the enslaved person. So the enslaved person tells his story, and this friend or journalist or lawyer writes down that oral story, right? The third type are fictional narratives, right? So they are stories that are completely imagined, like novels, for example, but they're not devoid of truth, right? They still constitute a very realistic portrayal of life in slavery, and they constitute also part of the literature of slave narratives. So we have fictional narratives, we have autobiographical, biographical, fictional narratives, and the fourth type of slave narratives are the oral histories, which we just talked about a minute ago. The oral histories, the WPA or the Federal Writers Project. The purpose of slave narratives, the most important purpose was first to persuade the South, the American South, that slavery went against the moral and spiritual values of America, right? Slavery, so these slave narratives, in a way, the purpose was to educate the American South and the population, especially the white population of the American South who lived of slavery, to persuade them that slavery went against the moral and spiritual values of America. Right? All men are created equal and are endowed by their creator of certain inalienable rights. These are the words of the Declaration of Independence. These are the values on which America was founded. And slave narratives, in a way, remind people, especially in the South, who practice slavery and have an economy based on slavery, they remind them, slave narratives remind them, that slavery is contradictory with America's moral and spiritual values. So that's the first purpose. The second purpose is that slave narratives exposed the shared humanity of Africans, thus their entitlement to equal treatment and to basic rights. Slave narratives explained, showed how African Americans share in the humanity of everybody else. They are humans, you know. They expose the shared humanity of Africans. They're humans. And that they're entitled to basic rights and equal treatment. I want to talk a little bit about the influence of slave narratives. Autobiographical narratives of former slaves comprise one of the most extensive and influential traditions in African American literature and culture. So, autobiographical slave narratives comprise one of the most extensive and influential traditions in African American literature and culture. Until the Depression era, that's the 1930s, slave narratives outnumbered novels written by African Americans. There were more slave narratives than novels written by African Americans by the 1930s. I want to talk a little bit about slave narratives and the project, the Federal Writers Project. The Federal Writers Project, or the Works Progress Administration, that's the WPA, between 1936 and 1940, over 2,500 oral histories were collected by the WPA. They were collected through interviews. 2,300 former slaves were interviewed by writers and journalists. The WPA, the Federal Writers Project, was conducted by mostly white interviewees. So people who were conducting the interviews, this is a time when only white people were journalists and writers, right? This is the 1930s. So the WPA, these interviews were conducted by mostly white interviewers. So they need to be read with caution. We need to read between the lines. We need to pay attention to the inconsistencies, sometimes ambiguous meanings, because the people who were interviewed speak in a very thick dialect in a language that belongs to the slave plantation of the South, folk memories, and sometimes the interviewees were 80 or 90 years old. So we have to keep all these things in mind when we read or listen to the interviews of the Federal Writers Project, the WPA. I want to talk a little bit about slave narratives and American literature and culture. Slave narratives directly influenced classical works of American literature, like Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which is a very famous American novel, directly influenced by slave narratives. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, a famous novel by Mark Twain, directly influenced by slave narratives. Beloved by Toni Morrison. This is an award-winning, powerful novel by the African-American writer Toni Morrison, and it's also considered by many as a contemporary slave narrative. Slave narratives directly influenced important cultural movements like the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s, jazz music, for example, or even other cultural and musical phenomena of the 1950s, 60s, and all the way to the present with hip-hop, rock and roll, swing, and all sorts of other cultural forms in which the black African-American cultural element is strongly present. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the political importance of slave narratives. Slave narratives had a political and a historical importance, besides their literary importance. So let's talk about each one of them. The political importance of slave narratives. First of all, they opened a dialogue about slavery and freedom in America in the 18th and 19th centuries. Right? This dialogue was opened because of slave narratives. Second, they enlightened white American readers about, first, the realities of slavery, because many white American readers thought that slavery was normal, that it was natural, and that African American who were enslaved were treated nicely and everything. Well, slave narratives shattered this image and explained and enlightened white readers about the realities of slavery, that it's harsh and inhuman, right? And it's often compared as hell on earth. The second thing that slave narratives did is enlighten white American readers about the humanity of black people, because many of them thought that black people weren't human. Sad, but this is the 19th century and 18th century. So slave narratives enlightened white readers about the humanity of black people as individuals deserving of human rights and equal treatment. Slave narratives were dismissed by opponents of, as anti-slavery propaganda, people who were invested in slavery and sought to protect slavery because their economy was based on it. Well, for these people, slave narratives were just propaganda, and they tried to get it banned and tried to get people who write slave narratives or sell slave narratives or tell slave narratives, try to get these people arrested and imprisoned. But slave narratives were very widely read, and this shows their power to provoke reflection and debate about race, social justice, and the meaning of freedom. Another importance of slave narratives is that they constitute a historical document. And this historical document, it chronicles the evolution of white supremacy, particularly in the South. This institution of white supremacy, how it was started and how it developed and where it got, right? Slave narratives are an excellent historical document, historical record, right? They constitute a historical record on white supremacy, from slavery to emancipation, to segregation and disenfranchisement. They also slave narratives evoke the national ideal of the American individual's quest for freedom. I mean, this idea is at the foundation of the United States. It's the idea of the individual searching for freedom. Well, what can illustrate this ideal better than an enslaved person, quest for freedom? So slave narratives evoke the national ideal of the American individual's quest for freedom and for a society based on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as the Declaration of Independence states. Slave narratives as autobiography, they gave a voice to generations of African Americans who were otherwise ignored by literature, right? They acquired a voice, especially with the autobiography, because they can sit down and write their story. And these people did not have a place in literature. Literature did not give them a voice. So slave narratives gave a voice to generations, not one nor two, generations of African Americans who were otherwise ignored by literature. Slave narratives as autobiography are also eyewitness accounts. Their eyewitness accounts became eyewitness accounts that reveal the struggles, the sorrows, the aspirations, the triumphs of the individual. Also, slave narratives as autobiography, they established the humanity of the writer as well as arguing against slavery. Let's talk a little bit about some typical features of slave narratives. The most common is the fact that slave narratives depicted slavery as hell on earth and portrayed slavery as physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual deprivation. That's what the enslaved person experiences: a physical deprivation, an intellectual, emotional, and spiritual deprivation. Also, another characteristic of slave narratives is the fact that at some point there is a personal crisis in the life of this individual who is enslaved, and this personal crisis precipitates a decision to escape, either selling or death of a loved one if his children are taken away from him and sold, right? And it precipitates a crisis. This person for the first time feels, I need to get out of here, I need to run, I need to find my children, right? So also this personal crisis is like a dark night of the soul. There is hope versus despair, right? And the decision to go for freedom, to try to achieve freedom, is usually the struggle. It's the dark night of the soul on its way to, hope and light and sunshine. Also, slave narratives are also, one of their characteristics is the arduous quest for freedom, which usually emphasizes faith in God, commitment to liberty, similar to the ideal of the founding fathers of the United States of America. Freedom includes arrival in a free state, renaming of oneself, so the enslaved person takes a new name, the name of a free person, and also commitment to anti-slavery movement. They become anti-slavery activists themselves, whose job now is to help other people, other enslaved people, find freedom. The most important element of the genre are they almost always begin with an introduction written by a white, wealthy editor or journalist or lawyer. So there's always this introduction by a white person. Slave narratives typically center on the narrator's journey from slavery in the South to freedom in the North. There was slavery in the South, and slavery was banned in the North. So if an enslaved person manages to cross what was called the Mason-Dixon line into one of the states in the north of the United States, that person becomes free. Slavery is documented as a condition of extreme deprivation, necessitating increasingly forceful resistance. After detailing an escape, when the slave narrative, for example, gives us the detail of an escape, the slave's attainment of freedom is signaled not simply by reaching the free state of the North, but by taking a new name and by dedicating himself to the anti-slavery activism. Also, one of their characteristics is that they show a commitment to both physical and intellectual freedoms, and they deal with issues of truth, credibility, and reliability. Slave narratives and the abolitionist movement. This is an important relationship because the abolitionist movement was a movement of activists made up of women, men and women, of politicians and lawyers and journalists and church people and religious people who were all, and writers and intellectuals, and all of them, they shared the same idea, that slavery went against the moral and spiritual ideals at the foundation of the United States of America, that slavery was immoral, both in terms of ethics and in terms of religion, and they dedicated their lives to ending slavery. And of course, slave narratives constituted an important part of the culture of these people. This was their ammunitions. Slave narratives was the ammunitions of the abolitionist movement. This is the text and the documents they used to fight slavery. So slave narratives became known as a voice of reality in the abolitionist movement. Slave narratives provide an opposition to the pro-slavery argument and idyllic pictures Northerners were exposed to, because in the South, people lived on an economy based on slavery. And of course, they tried in different ways to defend this slave-based economy. And they published books, they published novels, they published speeches, they published all sorts of, propaganda defending slavery, right? So slave narratives became the opposition voice to the South's pro-slavery arguments. Slave narratives also demonstrated African Americans' mastery of language and the ability to write their own history. That's very important. I mean, these people were were kidnapped from their homes in Africa. And 100 years later, they're writing literary documents in a foreign language, right? So they demonstrated, they didn't go to school, they were taken and enslaved, right? So most of them either came to America knowing how to write already, but mostly Arabic, right? And many of them had to learn English, had to learn to write in English. They taught themselves, and then they wrote their books. So slave narratives demonstrated African Americans' mastery of language and the ability to write their own history. The narratives also gave Northerners a glimpse into the life of slave communities, the love between family members, right? The respect for elders, the bonds between friends. Slave narratives also describe an enduring, truly African American culture, which was expressed through music, folk tales, and religion. I just want to give you a list of important and famous slave narratives, For example, we have the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave written by himself. Very famous book and a very famous writer and very famous thinker. Mr. Frederick Douglass was one of the first formerly enslaved people who managed to get a PhD in sociology. And Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a novel written by Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1852. Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacob in 1861. Up from Slavery by Booker T. Washington, written in 1901. Black Boy by Richard Wright, written in 1945. The Autobiography of Malcolm X, written in 1965. The Confessions of Nat Turner by William Styron, 1967. And The Autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman by Ernest Gaines, written in 1971. And Beloved by Toni Morrison, published in 1987. These modern texts show glimpses of the genre as they explore the origins of psychological as well as social oppression, and in their searching critique of the meaning of freedom for the 20th century black and white Americans alike. What remains in this lecture, you will find there is a little summaries of some of these slave narratives. Frederick Douglass, born in 1818 and died in 1895. It's probably the most famous and best read slave narrative is this one, Frederick Douglass. Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. This is the full title. So you will find some important details about it there. And then there is the little summary also about another book, Ulada Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa. This is the 18th century. It was written in 1789, so this is one of the very first slave narratives. It's one of the earliest records we have of slavery. We have the story of Nat Turner, who led a rebellion and a revolt, an armed rebellion. And then Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet A. Jacobs, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, published in 1861. So all of these little summaries give you an idea about individual slave narratives. I hope this lecture has been provocative and could trigger your curiosity to go and research the subject more, because it's extremely relevant and timely and extremely powerful to explore. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you in a future lecture. Bye-bye.